it's Mrs. F Science, your friendly neighbourhood teacher with ADHD. So, today's video is going to be something that I feel is incredibly important to you, and I hope that you agree. As your exams are coming up soon, you're going to need to know for Science GCSE everything that's going to be in the exam. I know that when you're in lessons all the time, it's super easy to forget things that you learned a while ago. So, the purpose of today's lesson is to literally give you a step by step breakdown of the GCSE science curriculum and everything that could be included in your exam. Okay, the very first thing I would recommend you do is grabbing a paper and a pen or something that you feel comfortable writing this down on and taking notes. Or if you'd rather not write this out yourself, I have already made the sheet I'm going to talk to you about today. It's on Etsy and it's on Tez. I'll put the link in the description below for those two. If you use the code YouTube, it's literally going to cost you £1. So first things first, you're going to need the columns along the top. So the ones I highly recommend are as follows. Have I learned about this yet in school? So is it that you're in year 10 and you haven't actually learned about it yet? So that's not really fair to be judging yourself on something you haven't learned yet. So I would then, for those sections where it says, have I learned it yet? If you haven't already, I would just put a little cross in it, put the date, you can come back to it when you have learned it. I would then make a column that says, have I studied this independently yet? So this is, have I sat at home or in a revision club or in homework club or with my friends, and have I looked at this topic independently from the classroom yet? Okay, so this next section I would think is quite self-explanatory, but just to explain, it's a confidence rating. So there's three sections. You would either put a little X and then the date it is, say today for me is the 16th of the 1st, 26. You would put a little X in there that says, yep, I feel super confident about this. I don't really need to do anything else. Amber, if you are like, okay, I kind of get it, but need a bit more practice, I'm not 100%. Or red if you like, this is where I'm super struggling. And of course, the ones that are red or amber are the things that you absolutely should tackle first. This final section is the most crucial section of the whole sheet, which is what are my next steps? Because you could be absolutely red on every single thing of this, but if you don't make a next step to help yourself, it kind of is all irrelevant. So next steps are going to include things like doing exam questions, doing some mind maps, asking teachers for extra things, attending revision clubs. So now you've got your sheet all set up, I'm going to individually go through each point on the specification now. It will show on the screen and I will also explain briefly what each section is. I recommend as we're going through this, you're making notes onto your table. You can pause this for as long as you need to get ready. So I'm in no way covering everything and every single specification point within this one video because it would take literally forever. However, what I am going to do is give you a rough overview of each specification point so that you can have in your mind, oh, I roughly know that topic quite well, or I really don't know anything she's saying about that topic. Maybe I should go back and look at that one. Okay, so we're going to start with the biology paper and we're going to start with part one, which is cell biology. So students learn about cell structure, cell division, transport in cells, and stem cells. This is also going to include things like osmosis, things such as active transport, diffusion. It's going to include the osmosis required practical, um, prokaryotic cells, specialized cells, all things such as that. Okay, point two for biology is going to be organisation. So students study how cells form tissues, organs and systems in animals and plants. So that's going to include things like your heart, things like the components in your blood, things like knowing that an artery goes away from the heart and a vein goes back in, things like your stomata, things like your leaf structure. Okay, part three, infection and response. So students learn how pathogens cause disease and how the body defends itself. So this is where you're going to need to know about your white blood cells and the three ways that they destroy pathogens. You're going to need to know about specific diseases like HIV, like gonorrhea, like tobacco mosaic virus, like rose black spot. You're going to need to know about malaria. You're going to need to know what a pathogen is and that there are bacteria, fungi, viruses, and protists as the four types of pathogens. Okay, so point four, we're at bioenergetics. Students learn how energy is transferred in photosynthesis and respiration. So, as you already have predicted, this is going to include the photosynthesis required practical. You need to know the word and symbol equations for photosynthesis and respiration, which of course are just the opposites of each other. Point five is homeostasis and response. Students learn how the body maintains stable conditions and responds to stimuli. So, in this, you're going to need to know the reaction time required practical. You're going to need to know a reflex arc and how you have sensory, relay, and motor neurons. You're going to need to know what a synapse is. You're going to need to know things that would be stimuli. So, point six is going to be inheritance, variation, and evolution. Students study genes, inheritance, variation, and evolution by natural selection. You're going to need to know how to do a Punnett square. You're going to need to know what a dominant and recessive allele are. You're going to need to know what phenotype means, what a genome means. And finally, for biology, then, you've got the ecology topic. Students learn about ecosystems, biodiversity, and the impact of humans on the environment. So, you're going to need to know how to do the fieldwork practical, what a quadrat is, why you would have to use a random number generator when putting out a quadrat. You're going to need to know what abiotic means, what biotic means. You're going to need to know what an ecosystem is, what a community is, what a population is. Okay, moving straight into chemistry. So, number one is atomic structure and the periodic table. Students learn about atoms, elements, isotopes, and trends in the periodic table. So, for this, you're going to need to know things like what does the group number mean? What does the period number mean? What is a proton, an electron, a neutron? What is the atomic and mass number? You're going to need to know how to find the number of neutrons. There's so much in this topic, it's basically everything periodic table. Okay, point two, you've got bonding, structure, and the properties of matter. Students study chemical bonding and how structure affects properties. So you're going to need to know what an ionic, a covalent, and a metallic bond are. You're going to need to know examples of giant covalent structures. Okay, so point three is quantitative chemistry. So students use calculations to understand amounts of substances and chemical reactions. So you're going to need to know relative formula mass. You're going to need to know how to calculate the percentage of an element in a compound. Okay, so point four is chemical changes. Students learn about reactions, including acids, alkalis, electrolysis, and salts. So you're going to need to know about the pH scale. You're going to need to know what color the universal indicator would turn a substance if it was an acid, if it was an alkali, if it was neutral. What is a neutralization reaction? You're going to need to know how to write out an equation for how a reaction happens and what would displace what. Okay, point five, you're going to need to know about energy changes. Students study exothermic and endothermic reactions and energy transfer. So you're going to need to know how to draw a reaction profile. You're going to need to know what exo and endothermic mean. You're going to need to know what activation energy means. Okay, point six, the rate and extent of chemical change. Students learn how factors affect reaction rates and reversible reactions. So you'd need to know the symbol for a reversible reaction. You'd need to do about the sodium thiosulfate required practical. You'd need to know also about how would, say, the surface area affect a reaction, the concentration of particles. Okay, point seven, you've got organic chemistry. Students study hydrocarbons, fuels, polymers, and functional groups. So I feel like that's quite self-explanatory. You need to know about an alkane and an alkene. You need to know about the fractional distillation crude oil. 3.8 is chemical analysis. Students learn how to identify substances using tests and instrumental methods. So that's going to be your gas tests, learning how to test for oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and chlorine. You need to know what chromatography is. Okay, point nine, you need to know about the chemistry of the atmosphere. Students learn about the composition of the atmosphere and climate change. So, quite self explanatory, but you need to know about the carbon cycle, the water cycle, deforestation, and basically the overall impact that humans have on the climate. And finally, for chemistry, using resources, number 10, students study sustainability, potable water, and life cycle assessment. So you're going to need to know what potable water is, drinkable water. You're going to need to know what a formulation is. You're going to need to know all about what pure means. And you're going to need to think about where you would get drinkable water from, as well as completing a life cycle assessment for a product when it's made. Okay, so last but most certainly not least, we have got physics. So, number one is energy. Students learn about energy stores, transfers, efficiency, and renewable resources. There is an absolute ton in this topic. You need to know energy is measured in joules. You need to know the 8 energy stores. You need to know the 4 energy pathways. There's an absolute ton of calculations you need to learn. You need to learn the units for everything. Ideally, you need to learn the formulas for the calculations, but you do get given some on a formula sheet. Okay, so point two, you need to know about electricity. Students study circuits, current, voltage, resistance, and electrical safety. So I feel like that's quite self-explanatory, but you need to learn the units for all of the things I've just said. You need to know that there's quite a few required practicals in this topic. You need to be able to tell me about plugs, about the national grid. You need to be able to tell me about electricity safety. Okay, so third of all, you've got particle model of matter. Students learn about states of matter and changes. This includes density. So you need to be able to tell me what do we mean by a solid, a liquid, and a gas? How do we transfer between a solid and a liquid? How do we transfer between a liquid and a gas? You need to know the density required practicals. There are three of them for regular shapes, for irregular shapes, and for liquids. Okay, so fourth, atomic structure. Students study atoms, radiation, nuclear decay, and nuclear energy. So for this, you need to be basically telling me the types of radioactive decay. You need to know what a half-life is. You need to know how to do the graph. You need to know basically how far each radioactivity can travel and what would block it. You need to know maybe about some nuclear events. You need to know about what a becquerel is. Okay, so number five, we've got forces. Students learn about motion, forces, momentum, and pressure. This is an absolutely massive topic. It includes so much. You need to know about Newton's laws. You need to know basically what makes up your stopping distance. You need to know things that would affect how quick you could stop on a road. You need to know about the required practical for acceleration. You need to know about speed, distance, and time and calculate it. You need to know about velocity, about vectors and scalars, about resultant forces. This topic is absolutely huge. Number six, you've got waves. Students study properties of waves, including sound, light, and electromagnetic waves. So you're going to need to know about the ripple tank required practical for this. You're going to need to know about the electromagnetic spectrum and starting with microwaves, ending with gamma waves. You're going to need to know about how radio waves are transmitted. You need to know how to calculate waves. And number seven, finally, you've got magnetism and electromagnetism. Students learn how magnetic fields and electromagnets work. So you'd need to know about things that would increase the strength of an electromagnet. You need to know what a magnetic field would look like and how to draw it. You'd need to know about the poles of a magnet. You'd need to know about the left-hand rule.